It was a rainy Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., the kind where the sky never really brightens and the air smells like wet concrete and old paper. Inside the National Archives building, tucked away in a quiet corner of the basement where fluorescent lights hummed like tired bees, a young archivist sat hunched over a metal cart, stacked with cardboard boxes. She wasn't famous. She didn't have a fancy title. She just liked order, liked knowing that every document had a place, every date a meaning, every name a story behind it. She'd been working on a routine FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act paperwork, something about environmental policy from the late 2000s. Boring, but necessary. Government work rarely made headlines, and that was fine by her. She preferred silence to spectacle. But as she flipped open the lid of a mislabeled box marked EPA Correspondence 2009, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. Thick manila folders sealed with red tape and stamped with a classification code she hadn't seen in years. Curious, she peeled back the tape. Inside were pages covered in dense legal language, handwritten notes in the margins, and a few grainy photocopies of emails. Most names were blacked out, but a few weren't. One name kept appearing: Jeffrey Epstein. Her stomach dropped. Epstein. The financier. The convicted sex offender. The man who died in a New York jail cell in 2019 while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. His name had become shorthand for a whole hidden world. Private islands, powerful friends, underage girls, and secrets that seemed to vanish into thin air. She'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. But this felt different. This wasn't gossip. This was paper. Real paper with dates, signatures, and references to meetings that never made the news. One page stood out. It was a log from early 2010, listing a series of follow-up discussions after Epstein's controversial 2008 plea deal, the one that let him serve just 13 months in county jail with work release, despite allegations involving dozens of minors. At the bottom of the list, in neat cursive, someone had written, "Oval Office briefing requested. Per POTUS directive. POTUS, President of the United States." Her hands trembled slightly. She glanced around. The basement was empty except for the distant clatter of a photocopier down the hall. She took a deep breath and kept reading. There were references to phone calls between Justice Department officials, notes about sensitive diplomatic concerns, and a mention of a private meeting at a Georgetown townhouse that included 3 cabinet-level advisors and 1 outside counsel. No names. Just titles. But the implication was clear. People at the highest levels of government had known more than they'd ever admitted. She didn't know what to do. Protocol said she should report the find to her supervisor, but something in her gut told her this wasn't just another misplaced file. This felt like a thread, one that, if pulled, might unravel something much bigger. That evening, instead of going straight home, she stopped at a small coffee shop near DuPont Circle. She pulled out her laptop, opened a secure messaging app, and typed a message to a journalist she'd met once at a public records conference, a woman known for digging into stories others avoided. She didn't give names. She didn't attach files. She just wrote, "I found something about Epstein. It's real, and it's tied to people who were in power a decade ago." 2 days later, the story broke, not on cable news, not on the front page of the New York Times. It started on an independent news site. Just a short piece titled "New Documents Suggest Epstein Case Was Handled at Highest Levels." But within hours, it was everywhere. Twitter lit up. Reddit threads exploded. By noon, major networks were quoting the report, scrambling to verify its claims. The documents themselves hadn't been released publicly, just described in careful detail, but the mere suggestion that top officials might have been involved in shielding Epstein sent shockwaves through the political world. And then, unexpectedly, came the voice no one saw coming. Barack Obama, who had been out of office for over 7 years, rarely commented on current scandals. He gave speeches about democracy, climate change, and young leadership, but stayed clear of partisan firestorms. Yet on a quiet Thursday morning, he sat down for a rare interview with The Atlantic. He wasn't defensive. He didn't attack anyone. He simply said, "If these documents are authentic, and if they point to any level of institutional failure or cover-up, then we owe it to the survivors to find out the truth. Not for politics, not for revenge, But because justice delayed is justice denied, his words landed like a stone in still water. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about old files or conspiracy theories. It was about accountability, about whether the system had failed the most vulnerable to protect the most powerful. Overnight, the tone of the coverage shifted. News anchors stopped saying allegedly so often. Survivors of Epstein's abuse began speaking out again, not just about what happened to them, but about how they'd been ignored for years, even after going to the police, even after naming names. One woman, now in her 30s, told a reporter, "We kept saying it, over and over. But nobody listened until it became convenient." Back at the archives, the young archivist watched all of this unfold from her tiny apartment. She hadn't expected to become part of history. She just wanted to do her job. But now her phone buzzed constantly. Unknown numbers, blocked calls, even a voicemail from a producer at a major network asking if she'd go on camera. She deleted them all. She knew her role wasn't to be in the spotlight. It was to make sure the truth had a chance to surface. Meanwhile, in Florida, another former president remained silent. Donald Trump, who had once called Epstein a terrific guy in a 2002 magazine interview, and later claimed he wasn't a fan after Epstein's arrest, said nothing. No tweets, no statements, no interviews. His team issued a generic line through a spokesperson. The former president has no comment on unverified documents or media speculation. But silence, in moments like this, speaks louder than words. People remembered that Trump and Epstein had been photographed together at parties in the early 2000s. They remembered Trump's Palm Beach estate was just blocks from Epstein's infamous mansion. They remembered flight logs listing Trump as a guest on Epstein's private jet, though Trump denied ever flying on it. Now, with new documents hinting at high-level involvement, the public wanted answers. Why wasn't he saying anything? Was it legal caution? Political strategy? Or something else? The contrast between Obama's measured call for truth and Trump's total silence became impossible to ignore. Late-night comedians joked about it. Political analysts debated it on panels. Even casual conversations at grocery stores turned to the question, why won't he just say something? But Trump stayed quiet. As the week wore on, pressure mounted on Congress. Senators from both parties demanded a new investigation. The Justice Department announced it was reviewing the newly surfaced materials. And quietly, behind closed doors, federal agents began re-interviewing witnesses from the original Epstein case, people who'd been dismissed or ignored years before. The young archivist received a visit from two agents in plain clothes. They didn't accuse her of anything. They thanked her. They asked careful questions about how she found the box, who else had access, whether she'd made copies. She answered honestly. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a whistleblower in the dramatic sense. She was just someone who noticed something wrong and chose not to look away. That night, she walked home through the rain again. The city felt different, charged, like before a storm. She passed a newsstand where headlines screamed about Epstein files and presidential secrets. She bought a coffee, sat on a bench, and watched people rush by, heads down, phones in hand, absorbing the news in real time. She thought about the girls in the documents, the ones whose names were redacted, whose voices had been buried under layers of privilege and power. She thought about how long it had taken for anyone to listen, and she wondered if this time would be different, because the truth wasn't just in the files. It was in the choices people made after they saw them. Would they look away again? Or would they finally do something? For now, the country held its breath. The story was just beginning. And somewhere, in offices and courtrooms and living rooms across America, people were deciding which side of history they wanted to be on. The rain kept falling. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like something might actually wash clean. The silence from Mar-a-Lago wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Like the kind of quiet that settles over a room right after someone says something they can't take back. In Washington, where noise is currency and outrage is a daily ritual, the fact that one of the loudest voices in modern politics had gone completely still spoke volumes. While news vans lined the streets outside the National Archives and reporters camped out near Justice Department headquarters, Palm Beach stayed sunny, calm, and strangely untouched. At the private club that doubled as a home for the former president, life appeared normal. Golf carts zipped across manicured lawns. Staff moved with practiced efficiency. Guests laughed by the pool. But behind the gates, something else was happening, something tense and coiled. Inside the main residence, lawyers huddled in a wood-paneled study, papers spread across a long table. Phones rang constantly, but only certain calls were answered. Others went straight to voicemail. Advisors debated strategy in hushed tones. Should he say something? Anything? Or was silence the only safe move? The problem wasn't just the new documents. It was the timing. It was the contrast. While one former president had stepped forward with a calm, principled statement about truth and justice, the other hadn't uttered a word, not even a tweet, not even a vague, fake news dismissal. And in the court of public opinion, that absence began to feel like guilt. People remembered things. Old interviews, party photos, quotes from decades past. I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. One clip resurfaced, played on loop across cable news. Another showed him at a charity event in 2000, standing just a few feet from Epstein. Both men smiling for the camera like they belonged in the same world, which back then they did. Palm Beach was small, elite, and tightly knit. If you were rich and famous enough, you ran into the same people at the same galas, the same clubs, the same charity auctions. But knowing someone wasn't the same as being involved in their crimes. Everyone understood that. Yet the question wasn't just about friendship. It was about what happened after the arrests, after the rumors, after the girls started speaking up, and now with fresh documents suggesting that powerful people had helped Epstein avoid real consequences, the public wanted to know, did he know more than he let on? Did he ever try to help? Or worse, did he try to stop the truth from coming out? Still, nothing came from him. His usual allies filled the void. A longtime friend told a reporter, he's got no reason to talk. He's been clear about Epstein for years. A former campaign aide said, this is a distraction. They're trying to drag him back into something that has nothing to do with him. But none of it felt satisfying. It sounded defensive, rehearsed. Like they were reading from a script written by lawyers who feared even a single misstep could open a door best left closed. Meanwhile, in Miami, a retired federal prosecutor sat at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of old case files. He'd worked on financial crimes in the late 2000s, not sex trafficking. But he remembered the whispers. He remembered how Epstein's case had been handled differently from the start, how the usual procedures seemed to bend, how local prosecutors suddenly deferred to federal authorities, who then cut a deal so lenient it shocked even seasoned lawyers. Now, with the new documents circulating, he couldn't stay quiet. He reached out to a reporter he trusted. I never saw direct evidence linking any president to Epstein's crimes, he said carefully. But I saw how the system protected him. And when powerful people stay silent, especially when they've been close to someone like that, it sends a message. It tells survivors they don't matter. His words hit hard, not because they accused anyone of breaking the law, but because they named a deeper failure, the failure to care. Back in Washington, congressional offices buzzed with activity. Staffers scrambled to draft letters, schedule hearings, and track down witnesses. One junior aide, fresh out of law school, found herself assigned to compile every public statement Trump had ever made about Epstein. It didn't take long. There weren't many. A few offhand comments in interviews, a denial in 2019 that he'd ever been on Epstein's plane, a claim that he'd banned Epstein from his club years earlier after a falling out. But when she cross-referenced those statements with flight logs, guest lists, and old social pages from Palm Beach society magazines, the timeline got fuzzy. The ban seemed to happen only after Epstein's first arrest. Before that, they'd been photographed together multiple times, once even sharing a table at a New Year's Eve party. She didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it was just the way wealthy circles worked. You mingled with all kinds of people, some of whom later turned out to be monsters. But the lack of any clear, consistent account made her uneasy. And the total silence now? That made it worse. Across the country, ordinary people were having the same conversation in living rooms, diners, and group chats. Why won't he just say something? Became a common refrain. Not in an angry way, not always, but in a confused, almost disappointed way. Like watching someone you used to admire refuse to stand up when it mattered. One retired teacher in Ohio wrote a letter to her local paper. I didn't vote for him, but I always thought he spoke his mind. Now when girls who were hurt are finally being heard, he's gone quiet. That says more than any speech ever could. Even some of his supporters began to shift. Not all. Many doubled down, calling the whole thing a deep state trap. But others, especially women, started asking harder questions. At a small business owners meetup in Arizona, one woman said quietly, "I supported him on the economy. But if he knew something and didn't speak up, that's on him." The pressure wasn't just coming from the left. Conservative commentators, usually quick to defend him, began expressing frustration. "Silence isn't strategy, it's surrender," one radio host said. "If you've got nothing to hide, say it. Clear the air." But still, nothing. Then came the leak. Not from the White House, not from Congress. From a former assistant U.S. attorney in Miami who'd worked on early Epstein-related inquiries. In an anonymous interview with a legal podcast, the person claimed that in 2018, during the Trump administration, there had been internal discussions about reopening the Epstein case more aggressively. But those efforts were slowed down after concerns were raised about political fallout and high-profile connections. The source didn't name names, didn't say Trump ordered anything, but the implication was enough to reignite the firestorm. If true, it suggested that even after Epstein was back in the news, even after new victims came forward, the system hesitated because of who might be implicated. Overnight, calls for a special counsel grew louder. Editorial boards that had stayed neutral now urged a full, independent investigation. And still, from Mar-a-Lago, not a word. The contrast with Obama's statement became impossible to ignore. One man, out of power for years, chose to speak up for survivors. The other, still deeply influential, chose to say nothing. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about character. In New York, a group of Epstein survivors held a quiet vigil outside the courthouse where his case had once been heard. They didn't chant. They didn't hold signs. They just stood together holding candles as rain began to fall. One of them later told a reporter, "We don't need grand speeches. We just need someone in power to look us in the eye and say, 'I believe you.'" So far, only one has even tried. Back in Palm Beach, the gates stayed closed. Reporters waited outside hoping for a glimpse, a quote, anything. But the only movement came from staff delivering takeout or maintenance workers trimming hedges. Inside, the former president watched the coverage on TV, according to people close to him. He reportedly grew frustrated, muttering about witch hunts and media lies. But he didn't go on camera, didn't call a press conference, didn't post. His silence became its own kind of statement, one that echoed louder with each passing day. And as the week ended, a new detail emerged from the unsealed documents, a reference to a 2011 meeting between a senior White House aide and a lawyer linked to Epstein's inner circle. The purpose? To discuss reputational management and media strategy. The note didn't say who approved the meeting, but it happened during a time when both Obama and Trump moved in overlapping elite circles. Before either was president, but when both were already famous, powerful, and connected. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about one man's silence. It was about a whole system that had let Epstein thrive for decades, protected by money, influence, and the unspoken rule that some people are too big to fall. Yet in the middle of it all, the most powerful response came not from politicians or pundits, but from ordinary people choosing to listen, really listen to those who had been ignored for too long. And somewhere in Florida, behind high walls and closed doors, a man who once commanded the world's attention chose to say nothing at all. The rain kept falling in New York. The candles burned low. And the country waited, not for a tweet, not for a headline, but for a sign that someone in power still cared about the truth. The courthouse in Manhattan didn't look like much from the outside, just another block of stone and glass in a city full of them. But inside, on a chilly Thursday morning, something historic was about to happen. A federal judge had ordered the unsealing of over 200 pages of old depositions from a civil lawsuit filed years earlier by one of Jeffrey Epstein's survivors. These weren't just dry legal statements. They were raw, detailed accounts, some handwritten, some typed in shaky fonts filled with names, dates, places, and moments that had been locked away for over a decade. Reporters lined up before sunrise, notepads in hand, cameras ready. Survivors sat quietly in the back rows, some wearing sunglasses, others holding hands. They weren't there for attention. They were there because they'd waited years, some most of their lives, for this moment. For someone to finally read what they'd said and believe it. When the documents were released, the internet exploded. Not with wild rumors this time, but with cold, hard text. Page after page described private jets, island getaways, massage appointments that turned into something far darker, and a network of powerful men who seemed to move through the world without rules. Some names had been blacked out in earlier versions, but now, thanks to the judge's order, many were visible. Among them, a former foreign minister from a European country, a tech billionaire known for his philanthropy, and 2 U.S. officials who had served at the cabinet level under different administrations. One deposition mentioned a dinner in 2010 at a quiet Georgetown home where important people discussed how to handle the Epstein situation without it becoming a scandal. The witness couldn't recall every face, but remembered one detail clearly. Someone said the White House didn't want this blowing up before the midterms. That line sent shockwaves through Washington. It wasn't proof of direct involvement, but it suggested that Epstein's case wasn't just ignored, it was managed. Like a public relations problem, not a crime against children. Within hours, newsrooms scrambled to verify every name. Fact-checkers worked overtime. Some outlets held back, citing legal concerns. Others published carefully worded summaries, naming only those already linked to Epstein in other reports. But the damage, or rather the truth, was out, and then came the most talked-about line of all. In one deposition, a woman described being flown to New York in 2009 and taken to a private meeting where she was told, "You'll be meeting someone important today. Just be polite." She said she was led into a room where a man she later recognized from news coverage was present. Someone who, at the time, held a high government position. She didn't accuse him of touching her, but she said he was there, and he didn't stop what was happening. The description matched no one exactly, but it was close enough to spark a firestorm. Pundits debated it endlessly. Was it Obama? Was it someone else? The White House under the current president issued a short statement. "We support full transparency and due process. No one is above the law." It was careful, neutral, but it didn't calm the storm. Barack Obama, still in Martha's Vineyard, didn't respond directly. But people remembered his earlier words. If these documents suggest any level of institutional complicity, it must be fully exposed. Now, with more names and more details, those words felt even heavier. Meanwhile, in Florida, the silence from Mar-a-Lago stretched into its second week. Not a single public comment. Not even a vague denial. His legal team, however, was far from quiet. They filed emergency motions to block subpoenas, related to guest lists from Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, lists that reportedly included the former president's name multiple times in the early 2000s. The argument? Privacy, relevance, harassment. But to many it looked like stalling. What made things worse was a newly surfaced security log from Epstein's New York townhouse. It showed a visit in 2004 by a man whose description matched Trump, tall with distinctive hair, arriving in a black SUV with tinted windows. Again, no crime was alleged, but the image stuck in people's minds. 2 powerful men, once seen as friends, now on opposite sides of a national reckoning, one speaking up, the other saying nothing. Back in New York, the survivors weren't focused on politics. They were focused on being seen. One woman, now in her 30s, gave a rare interview to a small online magazine. She spoke softly, choosing her words carefully. "I don't care about parties or who knew who," she said. "I care that when I told the truth at 16, no one listened. Not the police. Not the lawyers. Not the people who were supposed to protect me. That's the real scandal." Her words cut through the noise. For a moment, the country stopped arguing about presidents and started thinking about people. In a federal building in Miami, a retired FBI agent named Robert Hayes, 28 years on the force, mostly in white-collar crime, agreed to testify before a Senate subcommittee. He'd been quiet since retiring, tending to his garden and visiting grandkids. But when he heard about the new documents, he called his old boss and said, "I need to talk." On the stand, he didn't shout. He didn't point fingers. He just told what he saw. In 2016, he said, "We had credible leads on multiple individuals connected to Epstein. We had flight logs, witness statements, even financial trails. But the case kept getting deprioritized. Not officially, just quietly. Assignments changed. Resources shifted. It felt like someone didn't want it to go anywhere. When asked if he knew why, he paused. I can't prove intent. But I can tell you this, when you're investigating powerful people, the air gets thin fast. And sometimes the system chooses peace over justice. His testimony lasted less than 20 minutes, but it changed everything. It wasn't speculation. It was from someone who'd been inside the machine. Over the next few days, more former agents and prosecutors came forward. Not with bombshells, but with patterns. How tips were ignored. How victims were treated like liars. How Epstein's wealth seemed to act like a force field, deflecting consequences at every turn. And through it all, the public began to understand. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a whole ecosystem that allowed him to operate for decades. In schools, in churches, in community centers, people started talking, not just about Epstein, but about how society treats the vulnerable. Teachers held classroom discussions about consent and power. Pastors gave sermons about listening to the unheard. Even late-night comedians dropped the jokes for a night and simply said, "Believe survivors." The shift was slow but real. Back in Washington, lawmakers from both parties announced plans for a bipartisan commission, modeled after the 9/11 Commission, to investigate not just Epstein, but how institutions failed for so long. It wouldn't assign criminal blame, but it would map the system that let it happen. And still, from Palm Beach, nothing. But something else was happening behind the scenes. A documentary filmmaker, known for deep investigative work, released a short clip from unused footage shot at a charity gala in 2003. In it, Epstein stands near a buffet table, laughing with a group of men in tuxedos. Just a few feet away, two future presidents, then just public figures, mingle with donors. One is shaking hands. The other is sipping champagne. Neither is interacting with Epstein. But they're in the same room, same event, same world. The clip went viral, not because it proved anything illegal, but because it showed how normal it all seemed at the time. How easy it was to be near something terrible and not even notice, because the terrible thing wore a suit and donated to good causes. That night, a high school teacher in Chicago showed the clip to her civics class. This, she said, is why we study power. Not because it's glamorous, but because it's dangerous when unchecked. As the week ended, the young archivist from the National Archives received a quiet message from a survivors advocacy group. They didn't want her to speak publicly. They just wanted to thank her. "Because of you," the note read, "we finally have a chance to be heard." She cried in her kitchen, not out of fear or pride, but relief. She hadn't wanted fame. She just wanted the truth to have a fighting chance. And now, for the first time in a long time, it did. The documents were out. The voices were rising. The silence from some was growing louder by the day. But the real story wasn't in the halls of power. It was in the courage of ordinary people who refused to stay quiet any longer. And that, more than any headline or political statement, was what would change everything. The country was tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day at work, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles in your bones when you've watched the same story play out too many times. Powerful people doing wrong things, victims speaking up, the world pretending to listen, then moving on. But this time felt different. This time people weren't letting go. Polls started showing something strange, a sharp split, not just along party lines but along lines of belief. On one side were those who saw the new Epstein documents as proof of a broken system that protected the rich and ignored the hurting. On the other were those who called it a media circus, a political hit job, a distraction from real issues. But even within those camps, cracks were forming. Some longtime supporters of the former president in Florida began whispering to each other, "Why won't he just say something? Even if it's just to clear the air?" Meanwhile, in living rooms across America, kitchen tables became debate halls. Parents argued with their kids. Friends unfriended each other online. But something else was happening too, something quieter. People were talking about power, about who gets believed and who gets buried, about how hard it is to speak up when you're young, poor, or alone, and how easy it is for the powerful to disappear into silence. Then out of nowhere came a voice that cut through the noise. Barack Obama didn't hold a press conference. He didn't go on TV. He wrote an essay just a few pages long and sent it to a major newspaper. It wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was calm, clear, and deeply human. The title was simple: Truth is not a partisan virtue. In it, he wrote about his time in office, not to defend himself, but to reflect. He admitted that no administration is perfect, that mistakes happen, that sometimes, even with good intentions, systems fail. But he said the real test isn't whether you made a mistake, it's what you do when you find out. If we only seek truth when it serves our side, he wrote, then we've already lost. Justice isn't a weapon, it's a promise, and that promise belongs to everyone, not just the famous, the wealthy, or the well-connected. He didn't name names. He didn't attack anyone, but everyone knew who he was talking about. And for the first time in weeks, the conversation shifted not from who's guilty to what do we owe each other. The essay went viral, not just online but in churches, classrooms, and community centers. A high school in Ohio printed copies for its ethics class. A veterans group in Texas read it aloud at their monthly meeting. Even some conservative talk radio hosts, who usually dismissed anything from the former president, admitted it was hard to argue with. But while one former president chose words, the other chose stillness. In Florida, the gates of Mar-a-Lago stayed closed. Reporters still camped outside, hoping for a glimpse, a quote, anything. But nothing came. Not even a statement from his team, just silence. And in that silence, people filled in the blanks with their own fears, their own hopes, their own judgments. Then, something unexpected happened. A group of survivors, women who had been through Epstein's world and lived to tell about it, released a joint letter. They didn't ask for money. They didn't demand arrests. They asked for one thing: an independent commission. Not run by politicians, not controlled by either party. Just honest people with the power to follow the paper trail wherever it led. We don't want revenge, they wrote. We want understanding. We want to know why no one stopped him, and we want to make sure it never happens again. Their letter was short, but it carried the weight of years of pain. Within days, over 100 lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, signed on to support the idea. Even some who had once mocked conspiracy theories about Epstein now said, if there's nothing to hide, let's find out. But not everyone agreed. Some powerful voices pushed back hard. This is a witch hunt, one senator said on the floor. We're dragging people through the mud based on decade-old rumors. Others warned that such a commission could reopen wounds that have finally started to heal. But the survivors didn't back down. One of them appeared on a morning news show, calm and clear-eyed. Our wounds never healed, she said. They were just covered up. And covering up pain doesn't make it go away. It just lets it fester. Her words stuck with people, because they weren't political, they were human. Back in Washington, behind closed doors, serious talks began about how to structure the commission. Who would lead it? Who would fund it? How could they protect witnesses from intimidation? It wasn't easy. Trust was low. But for the first time in a long time, there was a shared goal, not to punish, but to understand. And then, just as the momentum was building, came the footage. A documentary filmmaker, who had spent years quietly collecting old event tapes, released a short clip from a charity gala in 2003. It showed a crowded ballroom, crystal chandeliers, men in tuxedos, women in gowns. Near the center of the room stood Epstein, laughing with a group of donors. A few feet away, two men who would later become president stood separately, neither speaking to Epstein, neither near him for long. One shook hands with a senator. The other chatted with a business leader. The camera lingered for just 10 seconds. There was no crime in the clip. No secret handshake. No whispered deal. Just two future leaders in the same room as a man the world now knew was a predator. But context is everything. Online, the clip exploded. Some said, see? Everyone knew him. It was that kind of world. Others said, that's exactly the problem. Evil hides in plain sight, dressed in a tuxedo. The filmmaker didn't offer commentary, just the footage, and let people decide. What mattered most wasn't the image itself, but the conversation it sparked. People began asking, how do we spot danger when it looks respectable? How do we protect the vulnerable when the powerful are the ones causing harm? In a small town in Iowa, a librarian organized a community discussion about the clip. Over coffee and cookies, neighbors talked about trust, reputation, and how easy it is to be fooled by charm. We teach kids to stranger danger, one woman said. But what about danger that comes from someone everyone trusts? That question echoed across the country. Meanwhile, in Florida, the silence continued. But rumors swirled. Some said the former president was preparing a statement. Others said his lawyers were fighting subpoenas behind the scenes. Still others claimed he was furious, calling the whole thing a setup. But without a word from him, it was all guesswork. Then, at a rally in the Midwest, he finally broke his silence. Not about the documents, not about the survivors, not about justice, but about the media. They're using old pictures and fake stories to destroy me, he told the crowd. It's all lies. Total lies. He didn't mention Epstein by name. Didn't address the flight logs, the guest lists, or the depositions. Just lies and witch hunts. For his supporters, it was enough. They cheered. They waved flags. They believed him, but for many others it felt like a dodge, like he was treating a moral crisis like a political inconvenience. Back in New York, one of the survivors watched the rally clip on her phone. She didn't cry. She just sighed. He still doesn't see us, she said to a friend. He sees a threat to his image, not real people who were hurt. That night she wrote in her journal, I don't need him to apologize. I just wish he'd see me as human. And that, more than any headline or hearing, was the heart of the whole story. Because this wasn't really about presidents or parties. It was about whether society values truth over comfort. Whether we're willing to look at the ugly parts of our past, even when they involve people we admire, and say, this was wrong. As summer turned to fall, the push for the independent commission grew stronger. Churches, universities, and even some corporations began calling for it, not because they wanted drama, but because they wanted healing. And in the quiet corners of the country, in kitchens and classrooms, in late-night conversations, people started choosing sides not based on who they voted for, but on what kind of world they wanted to live in. One side said, let it go. It's too messy, too old. The other side said, no. If we don't face this, we'll keep repeating it. And somewhere in the middle, a nation held its breath, waiting to see which voice would win. Fall had settled over Washington, D.C., the kind of crisp golden autumn that makes even government buildings look softer. Leaves crunched underfoot on the sidewalks, and the air carried that quiet hush that comes after a storm has passed, but not before it's changed everything. Months had gone by since that rainy morning in the National Archives basement. The frenzy of headlines, the cable news panels, the viral clips, they'd all faded into the background hum of daily life. But the story hadn't ended. It had just settled deeper, like sediment in a river shaping the ground beneath. The Independent Commission, finally approved after weeks of tense negotiations, had released its preliminary report. It wasn't a blockbuster. There were no smoking guns, no dramatic confessions, no secret tapes. But what it did have was something rarer: honesty. It confirmed what many had suspected but few had proven, that for over 2 decades, Jeffrey Epstein operated with shocking ease because the systems meant to stop him were either looking away, overwhelmed, or quietly influenced by power. The report didn't accuse either former president of illegal acts. It found no evidence that either had participated in Epstein's crimes or knowingly protected him from justice. But it didn't let them, or anyone, off the hook. Instead, it painted a broader picture, a culture where wealth and status created invisible shields, where young, vulnerable people were dismissed as troublemakers or liars, while powerful men moved through life untouched, where even well-meaning officials sometimes chose political peace over moral clarity. The report's most powerful line wasn't about names or dates. It was this: the greatest failure wasn't a single act of corruption, it was the daily choice repeated by many to look away. That sentence echoed in newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the country, because it wasn't about blaming one person. It was about recognizing a shared responsibility. In Martha's Vineyard, the former president who had spoken up early didn't issue a statement. He didn't need to. Instead, he did something quieter. He met with a small group of survivors at a private foundation event. He didn't give a speech. He didn't pose for photos. He just listened. For over 2 hours he sat in a circle, hearing stories he'd only read about before. One woman later said, "He didn't try to fix it. He just let us be heard." And that meant more than any apology. Meanwhile, in Florida, the silence finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. At a campaign rally in the Midwest, the other former president took the stage. The crowd roared. Flags waved, but when he spoke, he didn't rant about fake news or witch hunts. He didn't mention Epstein by name. Instead, he said something simple. "I've said before I wasn't involved. I didn't know what he was doing. And if anyone did, they should pay." Then he moved on to tax policy. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full acknowledgement. But for the first time, he'd said something that wasn't just denial. It was small, maybe even calculated. But in a world that had grown used to total silence, it felt like a crack in the wall. Back in Washington, lawmakers debated the commission's recommendations: stronger protections for whistleblowers, mandatory training for federal agents on handling trafficking cases, and a permanent office to review cold cases involving powerful suspects. None of it was flashy. None of it would make headlines for long. But it was real. It was change you could measure. And through it all, the young archivist who started it all watched from the sidelines. She'd gone back to her quiet work, sorting files, labeling boxes, keeping history in order. But she wasn't the same. She'd seen how one small act, just noticing something wrong and not looking away, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. One evening, she sat on her apartment balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker on. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from the advocacy group she'd quietly supported. They were hosting a small gathering for survivors and allies. No press, no speeches. Just people sharing stories over soup and bread. She almost said no. She didn't feel like a part of it. She hadn't suffered. She hadn't fought in courtrooms. She'd just done her job. But then she remembered something one of the survivors had told her months earlier. "You don't have to be a hero to help. You just have to care enough to act," so she went. At the gathering, she didn't speak much. She listened. She heard about fear, betrayal, healing, and hope, not as abstract ideas but as lived experiences. One woman talked about teaching her daughter to trust her gut. Another spoke about starting a nonprofit to help other survivors find legal help. There were tears, yes, but also laughter. Real, warm, human laughter. And in that room, the scandal didn't feel like a political weapon anymore. It felt like a wound that was finally being cleaned, slowly, carefully, so it could heal. Weeks later, the commission held its final public hearing. No dramatic reveals, no last-minute twists, just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth is rarely simple, and justice is rarely fast, but it's still worth pursuing. Afterward, a reporter asked one of the commissioners, "Do you think this changes anything?" The commissioner paused, then said, "Maybe not tomorrow. But someday a girl will speak up, and someone in power will listen right away, not decades later." That's how change starts. Back in New York, near the courthouse where so much of this began, a small plaque was quietly installed in a community garden. It didn't name Epstein. It didn't name presidents. It just read, "For those who spoke when no one listened. Your truth matters," and in Palm Beach life went on. Golf carts still rolled across the lawns. Guests still laughed by the pool. But something had shifted. Not in the headlines, but in the air. In the way people talked about power. In the way survivors were believed, not questioned. In the understanding that silence, even when it comes from someone famous, doesn't erase truth. It just delays it. The young archivist returned to the National Archives one Monday morning, same as always. The basement was quiet. The lights hummed. She opened a new box, labeled correctly this time, and began her work. But now when she handled old papers, she saw more than ink and dates. She saw choices. Moments when someone could have looked away but didn't. Moments when someone stayed silent and what that cost. She didn't know if history would remember her name. And she didn't care. What mattered was that the truth had a place to land. That someone someday would find these files and understand. This is what happens when we choose to care. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering autumn leaves down the street. The city moved on as cities do. But something had changed. Not everything. Not overnight. But enough. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't start with a shout. They start with a whisper. A document. A decision to speak or to finally listen. And in the end, that's what lasted. Not the scandals. Not the silences. but the courage of ordinary people who refuse to let the truth disappear.